Welcome to this brief Bible dive with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick. We're in a series of brief Bible dives where we're summarizing books of the Bible so that you can get a quick understanding of each of the messages and why each of the books matter. Today we're talking about the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And as we do this, we're going to ask ourselves a life application question. When things seem to be going horribly wrong for me, how can I trust that God's good plan for me and all creation will still be fulfilled? I'll repeat that. When things seem to be going horribly wrong for me, how can I trust that God's good plan for me and for all of creation will still be fulfilled? So the book of Genesis. The name Genesis is simply an ancient Greek word that means beginning. Now, if you're a Star Trek fan like I am, perhaps you recall the Genesis Project in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. The Genesis Project in the movies, it was a device that created a planet and began life on it, so we can see why the writers actually chose that name. Because you see with the Bible, certainly a much more ancient document than two of the Star Trek movies, we see that the book of Genesis is always about it's about the beginning of creation. It's about the early events in the interaction between God, God's own people, between God and creation. There's no way we could really cover the entire book of Genesis in any reasonable depth in this brief Bible dive, but we'll point out some of the highlights and the major themes. The book begins with an account of God creating the heavens and the earth, and then breathing life into the world. We hear about Adam and Eve in the garden, how sin entered the world through Adam and Eve being tricked by a serpent, often equated with Satan, although the story does not explicitly state that it's Satan when you read the actual words. They wound up eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and were subsequently expelled from the garden. And as an aside, the story simply says they ate the fruit of the tree. It does not say it was an apple. In fact, people have debated for millennia exactly what was this fruit. Some even say pomegranate. Some have even said corn. We simply know it's a fruit. We hear about the first murder when their son Cain killed their other son Abel. Later, things got really out of hand, and God decided to flood the world and start over, sparing no creatures on land other than Noah, his family, and the animals that they brought on the ark. Immediately after the flood waters receded, sin entered the world again, and God promised not to destroy the world in that particular way ever again. It's also at this point in the story that humans began to eat animals. Up until Noah and his family, up until when they departed from the ark, humans were commanded to be vegetarians, to eat not the animals, but, the vegetables, the fruit, so on. Noah's descendants then spread across the earth, and various languages developed as a result of the Tower of Babel incident, when people tried to build a tower to the heavens to be like God. Finally, we learn about Abram and Sarai, later known as Abraham and Sarah, who were led by God from Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur being a city, so in modern Iraq, led to what we would now call the Holy Land. Although old in years, God promised them this land and that they would have more descendants than the stars in the sky, than the sand on the seashore. And because of their old age, Sarah let Abraham then have a child with her handmaid Hagar. And this child named Ishmael was sent away with Hagar. And while they were in difficult conditions, we hear that God loved them, provided for them, and protected them. And interestingly, it's many years later that our Muslim neighbors claim descendancy from Ishmael, while our Jewish neighbors claim descendancy from Isaac. Abraham and Sarah, then, though very late in years, had this child named Isaac, from whom the Jewish people claim descendancy. Isaac and Rebekah married and had two sons named Esau and Jacob, who were twins. Jacob stole their father's blessing, and with his two wives, Leah and Rachel, had 12 sons, which led to the 12 tribes of Israel, although it is slightly more complicated than that, but that's a good overview. One son named Joseph was spoiled by their father Jacob. So his older brothers sold him into slavery, claimed that he was dead, and he wound up as a slave in Egypt, where through a series of events, he rose to be in the second most powerful position in Egypt, just next to the Pharaoh, who himself was probably the most powerful person in the world at that time. And Joseph wound up even saving an uncountable number of people from a famine because of his listening to God and his ability to interpret visions and dreams. Due to this famine, Joseph's own family, who thought that he was dead, traveled to Egypt to look for food because it was one of the only places to find it during the famine. This is when they all reunited, and it explains how the Jewish ancestors then wound up in Egypt, whereas we learn in the next book, the book of Exodus, they would wind up becoming enslaved. Just before the end of the book of Genesis, their father, Jacob, dies, and Joseph's brothers were afraid that Joseph, who's in major power at this point, would wind up taking revenge, killing them or harming them for what they had done to him years ago when they had sold them into slavery. And yet Joseph showed them grace and mercy, and he said something that really encapsulates so much of the major theme of Genesis. Joseph said to his brothers, and we hear it in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 through 20, quote, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today." This has sometimes been summarized as, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. Throughout all of Genesis, perilous events happen that seem to compromise or even endanger God's plan from being fulfilled. And yet, God's plan is still fulfilled. People do dumb things, and yet God's plan is still fulfilled. People attack God's people, and yet God's plan is still fulfilled, and so on and so on and so on. I'll admit again that I glossed over so much deep and rich material here in Genesis, but the overarching theme is that the God who created the universe is the God who loves us and has a plan for us and has a plan for all of creation. And despite the sometimes, idiotic things that humanity does that might seem to thwart God's plan is still fulfilled. And with all that being said, we come back to that life application question. When things seem to be going horribly wrong for me, how can I trust that God's good plan for me and all of creation will still be fulfilled? When things seem to be going horribly wrong for me, how can I trust that God's good plan for me and all of creation will still be fulfilled? So that's the book of Genesis in a nutshell. To learn more about our congregation, Beautiful Savior, our website is bslcmi.org. We'd love for you to share this video, to like it, and of course to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, go out and love God and love your neighbors.